If you've ever watched this channel and enjoyed the content, or if you're enjoying this episode, could I ask for a small favor? Please hit the subscribe button. Your subscription helps this channel more than I can explain right now, and also makes you an integral part of our success. I promise to return the favor by making the show increasingly better. We're on this journey together, and I'm willing to make that promise to you if you hit the subscribe button.
Wait a second.
Do we have a deal?
Recent high-profile killings involving Daniel Penny and Luigi Mangione have sparked debates over vigilante justice in the U.S. Penny, acquitted for the 2023 subway chokehold death of Jordan Neely, and Mangione, accused of murdering United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, have both received public support despite their vastly different cases. Is there a cultural shift, with digital media amplifying acceptance of violence by non-state actors against perceived societal villains?
I think there is a change in our society. It seems to me that social media and its ideas about decentralization, the breakdown of hierarchy, the breakdown of media, this idea that every person doesn't need an intermediary, doesn't need any formality or structure, has certainly permeated the culture in ways that probably weren't foreseen even just a couple of years ago. What we see in these two young guys who share so much in common, they're both 26, and they both killed. And on the day that, of course, Penny was acquitted by this New York jury, we see that Mangione is apprehended. To the extent that people believe that there is no longer a government they can trust, they might think very much so that they could take matters into their own hands. So it might seem unrelated at first, but I certainly think there's a connection between the very notion of decentralization and social media, that these are peer-to-peer nodes, that there's no central server, there's no central structure, or infrastructure, or corporation, or hierarchy which manages the connections between people. Now we see that the culture at large and the understanding of justice and how justice will be carried out. And I certainly think that we're seeing the overtones of that and these two extraordinary cases, which it would be, I think, a mistake not to compare them. Even though they're very different circumstances and involve very different people, there's remarkable similarities between them.
With shell casings inscribed with phrases like delay, deny, and depose, the murder of Brian Thompson, United Healthcare CEO, seems to carry a symbolic weight. Could this act signify a dangerous escalation in how individuals confront corporate power? And what does it say about the broader tensions in the healthcare industry?
Well, one man was gunned down with a homemade ghost gun, but the other side would say that the other man had killed thousands with paperwork. Is this the beginning of a class war? Maybe. Certainly we're seeing an extreme gap between the wealthy, the ultra-wealthy really, and the rest of the country. But this case was interesting because the assailant, the alleged assailant in this case, Mangione, was himself affluent. He wasn't for want of anything. He was a graduate of a elite private school, and his family, by all accounts, was very wealthy. They owned country clubs, and they owned retirement homes. They even owned a radio station. But it seems to me that this young man, at some point, there was an emergence of mental illness. So reportedly, he had suffered from very severe back pain. He had either one or two back surgeries, although it's been reported United Health was not his insurer. But he took inspiration from, of all people, Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and his manifesto, which believed that violence could be undertaken for a greater good. And that's incredibly misguided. So for this young man, despite all the resources and all the promise that he had a master's degree in engineering, he had a job, yet somehow we see this emergence of a mental illness where he begins to think that justice belongs to him. And that is really the whisperings of the devil, really, that you can take life, that you can murder, because first and foremost, the devil, Satan, is a murderer. We saw that death entered the world through his lies. And nobody apparently explained to this young man that in suffering, to the extent suffering was part of his motivation, that there's a dignity to suffering, that one can suffer well, that meaning can be brought from that. And he may have had certain ideas about Brian Thompson and his role as the CEO of United Healthcare. He may have had certain notions about the corruption of that industry. And a lot of people don't realize the insurance business really is the investment business, because the span of time between when an insurance company collects a premium and when they pay it out as a claim is called float. And during that time, they get to invest that float and earn a return on that capital. So there is immediately a conflict of interest in the insurance model itself to delay the paying of claims. Now, apparently United Healthcare had a terrible record. They were denying something like 2 times the number of claims as their competitors. And they had begun to introduce artificial intelligence, which reportedly had an error rate of something like 90%. So there likely were many people suffering from this corporation. But I don't think Mangione knew exactly what the role of Brian Thompson was. And he says in his written notes, apparently, that he acted alone, that there was no one else conspiring with him. But the circumstances are quite remarkable, that he knew exactly the time and the place where Brian Thompson would be so that he could assassinate him. At the end of the day, though, this is about a young man that has 2 things profoundly confused. 1, he doesn't understand that justice belongs to God. And 2, he doesn't understand that suffering is not something that's unique to him. And it's something that can be done with dignity. It can be had in such a way that it brings meaning to one's life. Now, he foreclosed on the opportunity to grow from his own suffering, the same way he foreclosed on the opportunity for Brian Thompson to have repentance for anything he may or may not have done right. And there's a selfishness in that. There's a sense of being one's own God when you take life, because we don't give life, right? We might have agency of life, but we don't actually create the spark of life, and we cannot take life. That's the 6th commandment. So this idea that he was going to take justice into his own hands, that he was going to bring about maybe an equilibrium in society, that he was going to spare others, well, he certainly didn't think of the wife or the children of this man. And he didn't think of the possibility that he's also foreclosing on his opportunity for future repentance. Maybe God had a plan for Brian Thompson, and that plan would be carried out in the future, that he would perhaps revolutionize the insurance industry. Maybe he would make the wrongs right. Maybe beginning with this investor conference, he perhaps had a change in mind to improve things because he was in a position to help thousands of people. But all of that ended when Mangione allegedly took his life. And the evidence is overwhelming. And I would say that anytime we roll into the position of God, when we take the prerogatives of God into our own hands, we are experiencing mental illness, because it is not our natural state to do it. The natural state of man is to know and love God, to live in humility. And pain and suffering, perhaps depression, this can lead to anger. And anger can lead to so many dark places. And you see it really in the images of this young man when he's being apprehended, when he's being taken into custody in the local precinct in Pennsylvania. You see this rage in his face. And you ask yourself, where did this rage come from? Why was this young man, with all the promise, with all of the benefits of wealth and affluence in a largely free country, why did he not learn the most basic things which would have given him a chance to do something truly great with the talents he was given? Instead, he did one of the worst things he could do.
Are symbolic details like inscribed shell casings evidence of a dangerous shift in public approval of vigilante violence? What does this say about escalating tensions, from confronting corporate power to redefining justice in a fractured digital age?
You know, Penny and Mangione had a few things in common other than just their age and their leisure activities. They both came upon the people whose lives they would take. They came from behind. And when you watch the body cam footage from the police in Penny's case, one of the first things the police ask is, was Neely armed? And he wasn't. And by all accounts, Neely never laid a finger on Penny or anyone else on the train that day. Now, I'm not here to judge Penny's actions. I believe him when he says he was afraid, and I believe him that he felt that Neely was a threat. But The real failure, the failure of Mangione and Penny, is all of our failures. It's the failure of the whole culture. Because when you look at this man on the floor in this chokehold, he was dying. Anyone looking at his eyes could see death in his eyes as the minutes passed in that chokehold. And to the extent Penny was really afraid, it's hard to imagine that fear lasted for so long, because two other men held down the unusually thin arms of this man who was homeless. And all the witnesses seemed to agree he definitely had said he was hungry and that he was thirsty. So he was the poor amongst us, and he was having a mental health crisis. He had drugs in his system, so we can say that maybe he was being attacked by his own personal demons. This was a young man who was a victim of a system. He was the victim of horrible crimes even before that day when he would lose his life. His mother's life was taken violently, and at the age of 14, he had to testify at trial. Later in life, he would enter into the system even further as a foster child, and he would age out and eventually wind up on the streets, and he would be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Imagine 14, a fragile 14-year-old, learning that their mother had died in such a violent and bloody way. And one of the first witnesses the police asked on the train that day regarding what he had said was, he said, "Today somebody is going to die." Now, perhaps the passengers on the train took that to mean it was going to be one of them. He was acting erratic by all accounts. He was acting aggressive. But we could also say that those words were, in a way, prophetic, because he would lose his life that day. And he would become part of a cycle of violence, the same violence that his mother had suffered. And now he would suffer a violent end. And as I watched that footage, I couldn't help but think, this man was on the floor struggling. He was not a strong man. This was not a bodybuilder. He wasn't on the way to the gym. He looked malnourished to me. And as two other full-grown men held his arms, which he was not struggling and fighting very much from what I could tell, I couldn't help but ask myself, couldn't Penny have just loosened up a little bit? Without judging Penny, after all, judgment is not ours. It's God's, just like justice is God's. And then I see him finally let up. It's something like, I think, 56 or 58 seconds after he stopped moving. And as his lifeless body lay there on the floor, Penny gets up and he's standing there, and eventually the police come. And the witnesses are standing around and the police, and this lifeless body remains on the floor. And nobody offers to help him. Actually, one man did. One man tried to put water on his forehead, and Penny stopped him. And as the police stood there talking to witnesses and asking Penny what happened, Penny made no effort to start CPR. Now, he says that he learned that chokehold in basic training as a Marine, but Marines in their basic training also learn CPR. And the only thing he did for the man was prevent another man from offering him comfort. And I was shocked as I observed these clearly distressed passengers. They looked fed up, they looked tired. I think we could say reasonably that it's not the first time they had seen erratic and drug-fueled behavior, psychosis, from homeless people in the subway in New York. I'm sure that's a daily occurrence. But there was a sense of inhumanity about all of it. The sense that they had forgotten that every life is sacred. That even the most broken life, a life where someone wrestles with many, many demons, still reflects some of his glory. But one of the first things he told the officer is that he saw no weapon on him. And so, once the officers are there and they're interviewing Daniel Penny, I'm struck that they shake him like he's a rag doll on the floor. And they then proceed to put on their latex gloves, and the officer's putting on his gloves, and he's getting confused which one's on the left and which one's on the right, and he's putting it on and he's taking it kind of off again and he's trying to get it right. And you can just see the seconds passing. And the seconds turn into tens of seconds and probably minutes. It certainly seemed to be minutes as I watched it. And nobody even took his pulse. So this is not a failure of Daniel Penny. It's a failure, and it's really an indictment of our culture. Penny's reaction when the jury acquitted him, he went to a bar and went drinking and celebrating with his lawyers. A hero is someone who recognizes that to take another's life, even if it's necessary to protect innocent life, is a tragic moment in their life. There's nothing to celebrate. And when we see the political elites in our country making this to a politicized matter, I mean, certainly on the left and the right, it's a tragedy for all of us, not just for those who knew this man who died so prematurely. I think he was 30. Not just for his father, who was attacked in the media and berated, as if we know him, as if we know his story, why he was absent. You know, in our society, that's the problem. We all think we know so well, but we don't really know. This isn't a bipartisan issue. You can't simply look at Mangione and say, well, good, he took on corporate greed and corruption. And we celebrate him. You know, you see these young men in New York having a costume look-alike party and people selling merchandise on Amazon and eBay to celebrate. What a misguided society. What a society that has lost track of the sanctity of life. Sometimes life must be taken. There is such thing as evil in the world. But what we really see is not so much whether or not we're in the camp that Daniel Penny was a hero, or that he was a villain, or that his vigilante conduct was inappropriately valorized, or that Mangione is now a vigilante hero for some political party. Maybe people will say in simplistic terms that Mangione was a hero for the Liberal Democrats who protest, who declaim against corporate greed and excess, which leads to the loss of life. To be sure, there are corporations which kill for profit. We see it all the time in the pharmaceutical industry and the health insurance industries. Perhaps you can say it's their cousin. But that's a mistake. It's a mistake to look at Daniel Penny and say he is a hero for conservative Republicans, for those who declaim against the social ills of drugs and homelessness in liberal cities like New York. All of that's a mistake. It's not binary. It's not a partisan matter. It's a human matter. And when Americans become conditioned to think that they must take a side, and that necessarily their side is the right one, and the other one is the wrong one, that's a fractured society. And it is fractured because of technology, in part at least. It's exacerbating the problem. This idea of we can cut out every intermediary, every source of authority. That's why in our society today we see so many young commentators, because the young lack wisdom. And we don't often listen to those who are older. And we don't appreciate the teachings that come from the church and her wisdom. Because actually we are all responsible for Thompson's death. And we're all responsible for Neely's death. Penny and Mangione, they're just a byproduct of our culture. We should pray for them, and we should certainly pray for the repose of these two men whose both of their lives were cut short. We don't know what potential their lives held. We don't know that they wouldn't have gone on to do great things potentially. Who amongst us hasn't had a moment of weakness? Who hasn't suffered? Who hasn't felt the strain of the pressures of work as Thompson likely felt? Was he wealthy? He was. There was allegations of insider trading. They're unproven. Maybe they're sincere. Maybe they're real. Maybe they're legitimate. Maybe they're not. But as I said before, maybe Thompson would go on to be a great change agent in the insurance industry. But we'll never know, because ultimately it wasn't God's will which was done. It was the will of two men. And even if you were to take an example from secular culture, putting aside the teachings of the church and her wisdom, we see these Marvel comics like Spider-Man. Do they rejoice? Do they party when they take life? Even when they confront the mega villains, they do so with great reluctance. Because that power, the power which Penny had in his arms that day, in his hands, healthy hands, well-fed, strong. And so you see this inhumanity in our culture. And that is what really matters. All of these other things, this debate you see raging in the media and on social media, that's just distracting from the truth. And it's been said there's nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. While people debate whether or not he held his neck too long, whether or not the other man was really a threat to innocent passengers on the train, is to miss the point. The point is, everyone from the other passengers to the witnesses to Penny simply didn't see a human life. They didn't see a child who had a mother and a father that had potential still, who was only 30, who had suffered unimaginable trauma in his early life. Even if you had to take his life, at least recognize the mystery of death. And if Penny thinks he's free from all of this, he's not free. His judgment is with God. And for the rest of his life, he's marked by this event and how he chooses to handle it. People will not forget. Those who are wounded by this will never forget his face.
In a society where Daniel Penny is acquitted for killing Jordan Neely, a man shaped by systemic neglect, while Luigi Mangione faces trial for allegedly killing a corporate leader, accused of profiting from that very system, how do we decide whose humanity matters and who deserves justice?
We don't get to decide. Because justice belongs to God and God alone. What we really need to think about is the souls of men, the condition of the soul of Daniel Penny, and the opportunities which were robbed from the man who lost his life on the train that day, and the opportunities that were lost from the man who was shot in the back that day in New York on a sidewalk. That's what we have to think about, that we're not just animals. Justice isn't just about what happens to our corporeal self. Will we spend the next 15 years in jail, or will we spend life in jail? But what's our relationship to God? Why do we think that we get to decide? Do we not know that God can work through anybody? The most lowly, homeless, the poor, the corporate leader? Why do we believe in our hubris that we know who's justified and who's not? Where's the humility in that? And you look at these people on the train. They're so tired. They've seen so much violence. They've seen so much of the scourge of drug abuse. And you look at Daniel Penny, and he seems calloused. The police, they seem tired. The throngs of people around the country who celebrated the death of Brian Thompson as if they knew him personally, as if they were aware of his personal transgressions, as if they really knew the inner workings of United Healthcare. The reality is, a company that large, there's a very good chance the CEO had very little first-hand involvement at any individual claim level. Can sin be corporate? Absolutely. Can corporations with great power, what was it, $281 billion in revenue, I think? Can they act in a way which is institutionally evil? Of course. But why would we foreclose on that person's opportunity for Matanya, for a change of mind, to do something good? Brian Thompson was young as well. All of that was robbed in a moment of senseless violence. In the case of Penny, we see a cold callousness. There was a need for a chokehold, but no need for CPR. In the case of Mangione, there seemed to be almost a frivolity about it. In the note he left apparently in his backpack, he was impressed with his own engineering skills, that he could create a ghost gun. He said boldly that it was something that had to be done. And that's the sign of an out-of-control ego, of megalomania, a mind clouded by anger. and maybe a mind clouded by fear, a fear of the future, of the unknown. Penny says he was afraid. Well, when we have some faith at least, we can see the world differently. Maybe that man didn't have to be killed on that train that day. Brian Thompson didn't have to be killed, certainly. And will one more claim get approved because of it? It's doubtful. Do you really think that the actions of this one man is going to suddenly change the prevalence of greed in corporate America? It's unlikely. Greed is very powerful. Mangione had an education. He was smart, by all accounts. If he felt that there was corporate fraud that was depriving people of their life, of their health, could just as easily have exposed it. But why he thought that violence was a reasonable answer and that the taking of a life was his prerogative is an extraordinary commentary on the state of our culture.
When a homeless man's cries for help are met with lethal force and a corporate CEO's death sparks outrage despite allegations of denying life-saving care to thousands, what does this juxtaposition reveal about the values and priorities of our justice system and society at large?
It seems clear to me that if we take the gospel as a yardstick, as it were, Christ clearly had a preference for the afflicted, for the poor, for the fatherless, for the widow, for those struggling with demons. In this case, we can say drug addiction. And to think that Christianity always has this necessity for pacifism, well, we see it in the Desert Fathers, to be sure, the preference for pacifism, but keep in mind they were monastics. It's a little bit more complicated when it comes to those who are married, fathers, family men, for example. But there's no evidence from the gospel that Christ always insisted on pacifism. In fact, he overturned the tables of the money changers and drove out the ox and the sheep from the temple, and he did so with a whip, essentially. It's interesting to note, of course, that the money changers today are essentially the Wall Street bankers. We can say the investors, those who collect interest even, because the money changers were taking a cut. That's what brokers do. They come between a transaction. So the one time we see Christ act with force, with aggression, is against those, presumably the wealthy, we can say, and those who are involved in financial markets. But I'm not saying Brian Thompson was an evil man, and I'm not saying that Daniel Penny wasn't justified. But at first glance, the man who was really suffering, of course, was the man who lost his life on the train. And the man who was not suffering, Brian Thompson, he had a significant income. I believe the executives at United Healthcare had sold, I want to say, something like 100 million in shares, I believe, before disclosing their data breach not too long ago. To the extent that Jordan Neely was just having a mental health breakdown and needed help, maybe needed a warm meal, there's a certain juxtaposition, we can say, that the man who had to take his life will go free. And I don't see a scenario where Mangione goes free, based on the evidence we're hearing about. And he showed aggression towards a money changer. Now, he's not Christ, and Christ certainly didn't take anyone's life. But it may be symbolic, at least in a way, of just how upside down our culture is. That Jordan Neely was a product of a system of inequality, and a system that allowed certain members of our society to suffer inordinately. Did he have choices along the way? Sure. But when you have that kind of trauma at the age of 14, I'm not sure how much your free choice plays into it. And unless you experience trauma at a young age, you probably wouldn't understand that. And then we see, of course, the man, if the allegations are true about United Healthcare, if thousands of lives were lost because they wanted to meet quarterly estimates, as many large corporations want to do, you could see a scenario where using AI or any computer code, any algorithm really, you could very easily postpone the paying of policies, paying them out to preserve capital and to juice returns. And then you'd meet analyst estimates for your quarter. And executives would probably get their bonuses and their stock options. And you'd have this continuation of misaligned incentives. In a world where life, as we can see from the subway of New York, is no longer sacred. It doesn't have that much meaning. That's mammon. That's the worship and the glorification of material things, of wealth. It's the insanity and the irrationality of greed, which is just the other side of the coin from fear. It's that we've dehumanized one another. The society jumps in on each side as if it were totally binary, looking at the other side as if they're wrong, and in a sense of self-righteousness, they're right. And the opportunity to bring some meaning from all of this suffering, from all this tragedy, is overlooked completely. It's said that Neely, at one moment, Penny had loosened up a bit, just enough, and he spit up blood. Then another one of the witnesses explained to Penny that the man had defecated on himself and that was a sign that he was dying. He even told Penny, you don't want to murder him, or something to that effect, or you don't want to go to jail for murder. There's a certain callousness not to offer the man even cool water on his forehead. Actually, it's reminiscent really of Christ being offered a sponge with vinegar on it in his last moments. Penny stopped it for reasons best known to himself. And nobody tried to give this man CPR, first aid. And in like fashion, these foolish young people across the country who leave these callous comments online about Thompson's death that sell merchandise, lionizing Mangione, they promulgate the worst sickness, the worst lies in our society. We have to repent as a society. We have to turn back towards God. There's no alternative. We're going too far. We're destroying ourselves from within. And if we fall as a country, as a culture, it will be all of our faults. And I would say that very much so, Brian Thompson's blood is on all of our hands. The last breaths of Jordan Neely were squeezed out by all of us. Thompson may have controlled a system that Neely was a product of. But we're all Daniel Penny. We're all Mangione.
With the public increasingly distrustful of health insurers and lawsuits piling up against United Healthcare, Thompson's death seems to echo deeper systemic failures. The inscribed shell casings delay, deny, and depose, and the targeted nature of the attacks suggests a dark symbolism. Some view his death as an act of justice. But who bears responsibility for the environment that fostered such a grim outcome? The industry, the public, or both?
You know, think about the chaos of violence. Mangione is reportedly disappointed that United Healthcare might have taken life through a sin of omission by not paying a claim. And in response to that, he's going to take life. Where's the logic in that? It makes him no better than United Healthcare. You know, we as human beings, we take something so simple and we make it complicated. In terms of who's responsible, we're all responsible. What about the shareholders of United Healthcare? Is it going to shoot them too? Because they handed over their capital? What about the employees? They're probably not that different than Mangione. They go to work, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. They get a paycheck, they pay their mortgage, they pay their car payment. Are they responsible too? It's a system. It's a culture. And the bigger the corporation, the more it reflects the culture at large. Those employees of United Healthcare, they could resign. Why didn't they? We can't say that this is very profound thinking, to be sure. This is madness, the madness of a crowd. All those people who celebrate Mangione's targeted killing, his assassination of Brian Thompson. Would they really advocate that to their families? Would they come out without masks on in their dress-up contests, trying to emulate him like he's some sort of hero? Would they go to work and tell their boss how fondly they admired, the virtue of assassination? Look at the madness of our society. There's no way out of this, the way we're going now. The only way out is to go back to virtue, to Christian virtue, to understanding what God has revealed to us. The only path to sanity is to recognize the laws written on our hearts, that what God instructs us, what he tells us in his holy scriptures and through the teachings of his holy church, is the only way out of this madness, murderous madness, out of the scourge of drug use and homelessness and hunger, out of the scourge of fear of one another. You say distrust, the distrust of the healthcare industry. Well, the riders on that train in New York, in the subway, down in that tunnel, distrusted each other. A man has a mental health breakdown. Maybe he just needed a gentle word. I don't know. But he didn't need to have the life squeezed out of him. That much I'm certain of. Did he need to be restrained? Yes. For 6 minutes? No. Did he need CPR? Yes. Did he get it? No. Did Brian Thompson engage in corporate governance failures? In malfeasance? Was there greed involved that deprived people of their claims being paid? If I was a betting man, I bet he did. But he deserved to be assassinated? No. Is it anyone's prerogative to do that? Absolutely not. Look at the news reports. Look at the podcasts. All they are doing is exacerbating the problem, getting people wound up, believing that they're right in their belief, whichever belief that may be, that the other side is necessarily wrong. And in a week, in a month, corporate greed will be there. Homelessness and drug abuse will be there in the subway system. And people go on with their lives as if it's not their problem, as if it's someone else's problem. And these extraordinary events, will they have left a mark on anyone? An indelible mark that maybe they ought to be a little bit more generous to their neighbor, not so reckless. Maybe that's a neighbor who's suffering with sickness and their claim's not being paid. And they need kindness or maybe some financial support. Or maybe the homeless guy in the subway, maybe he just needs a meal that day. Maybe he could be put up in a hotel even. Will they do that? Will they change their conduct? Or will they go about their day thinking that they're justified because they're in the right camp, they got it right, and the other half got it wrong? Is that how we'll proceed as a culture, as a country? If we do, then we're in our last days of the preeminence of America. To the extent we turn our back on God and we seek vengeance for our neighbor, we think that justice belongs to us and that we can take human life, whether that's in the womb through abortion, whether that's through unjust wars, whether that's through an indifference towards killing that we see in far-off countries, whether it's through assassination or through an extended chokehold on a homeless man, a thin homeless man. If that doesn't touch us, if that doesn't bring about a certain sadness in our heart, if we can't feel the blood coursing through our veins as being like that of the blood coursing through our neighbor's veins, if we can't connect with our fellow man to feel that we're squeezing life out of him, or that a man walking on the sidewalk, we feel nothing when a bullet pierces him through his chest, and suddenly his children are robbed of a father. If we can't feel that, we've lost our humanity. And I think if we lose that, we lose our salvation. We cannot expect anything good to come from that. We're in darkness, and there we'll remain until we repent, until we can feel again, until we can feel our connectedness to our fellow humans, till we can understand that their life has value, and that our life may not be the most important thing in the world, but rather to even give our life for others rather than to take it. That is the way out. That's what Christ did.
He has a poor track record on fasting. He was once accused of using vulgar language, but he said the accusation was bullshit. He loves the smell of gasoline and burning oil around his motorcycles, and never stops drinking Coke Zero. He hasn't learned how to walk away from a fight. He's been to hell and back more than once, bringing a few public companies along for the ride. Other clergy scoff at him. The SEC and Big Pharma try to, quote, silence him for good. But their efforts haven't had the intended effect. That's Father Emmanuel.
Growing up in Tirana, where the call to a dawn echoed from the spiraling minarets, was a powerful experience for her. Albanians were forced to convert to Islam under Ottoman rule. In 1967, under the Marxist-Leninist regime, Albania became the world's first atheist state and destroyed churches to eradicate Christianity, in a land where St. Paul once preached the gospel. Her grandfather fought as a guerrilla fighter, and her father commanded a tank brigade. When communism collapsed, there was an insurrection against the state, leading to anarchy. Albanian women are known for their resilience. It is said they are born from the barrel of a gun. As a teenager, her father was flown out of the country without notice on a military helicopter to save his life. From then on, she started sleeping with an AK-47 next to her bed.